The morning the horses came was a Tuesday in early April of 1998. I remember the air had that particular cold, clean edge to it, the kind that promises a warm afternoon but doesn't deliver it until you've already given up and gone inside for coffee. A low fog hung over the creek bottom, thin and white, a sign the ground was finally waking up after a long, hard winter. The truck that brought them was a long-haul cattle liner, and the driver, a man from out of state with tired eyes and a stained logbook, backed it down the county road with a sigh of relief. He'd been on the road for 2 days. 28 head of Suffolk punch draft horses. They weren't much to look at, not in the way a show animal is. They were built low and wide, the colour of a newly minted penny, with no feathering on their legs to collect the mud we have too much of in the spring. They were bred for one thing, pulling. The sale had been a dispersal, an old farmer in the next state whose sons wanted nothing to do with what they called obsolete horsepower. I'd bought the lot, the whole working string, for a price that felt both like a steal and an anchor. As they came down the ramp, one by one, their hooves clattering on the metal before thudding onto the soft dirt of my lane, they looked around, taking in the place with a quiet, solid appraisal. They weren't flighty. They just looked. My father always said you can tell a lot about a horse by what it notices. These horses noticed everything. By 9 that morning, my neighbour's truck was idling at the fence line. It was a new 3/4 ton, the kind of truck that's washed more than it's worked, the chrome on the grille still winking in the flat morning light. He rolled down his passenger side window, leaning over the console. He didn't get out. "Morning," he said, his voice carrying that polite, measured tone that means he's about to ask a question he already thinks he knows the answer to. I was checking the latch on the gate to the holding pasture. I just nodded back. "Saw the semi," he said. He gestured with his chin toward the 28 broad, chestnut-coloured backsides grazing on the new grass. "That's a lot of mouths to feed." I agreed that it was. He waited, expecting more. When I didn't offer it, he finally got to the point. "Heard you were going to clear that 80 west of the creek, the old stump ground." I told him that was the plan. With them? He didn't say it with malice. It was worse than that. It was with a kind of gentle, bewildered certainty. The kind of certainty a man has when he's just run the numbers and knows you haven't. "You know what a diesel skidder rents for these days? You could have that whole parcel cleared, piled, and ready to burn in 3 weeks. 4 tops." I knew. I'd made the call. $18,000, the man at the rental yard had told me, plus fuel and delivery. A machine that could pull a stump every 3 minutes, a hydraulic claw that could stack them like cordwood. The man on the phone had been helpful, efficient. He had it all figured out. He even told me the average number of stumps per acre on that kind of cut-over land and calculated a timeline. He was a man with a clipboard full of answers. My neighbour was the same kind of man. He was trying to be helpful. He was trying to save me from myself. "This here," he said, and he meant the horses, "this is going to take you all summer, maybe into the fall. You'll be feeding them the whole time. It don't pencil out." I didn't have a good answer for him, not one that would make sense across a fence line on a Tuesday morning. So I just said, "I'm not in a hurry." He shook his head slowly, a little smile playing on his lips. It was the smile of a man who is watching his neighbour indulge in a folly, a nostalgic whim that will soon meet the hard reality of a balance sheet. He was already composing the story he would tell down at the co-op. By noon, the diner had a version of it, and by evening, the version had grown. I was a sentimental old fool, trying to farm like it was 1930, spending a fortune on pet horses to do a job a machine could do for a fraction of the cost, and in a tenth of the time. They weren't wrong, not on the face of it. The math didn't work. The timeline was backward. It was an inefficient, expensive, and stubborn way to go about it. What I didn't say, what I couldn't explain, was that I wasn't just trying to clear the land, I was trying to read it. I had a suspicion, a thread I was trying to pull, and I knew a machine couldn't do it. A machine is too loud. It doesn't listen. The horses, though, they were already listening. As they spread out across that holding pasture, they moved with a purpose, their heads down, their big lips sorting through the grasses. They were already telling me things about the soil, about the drainage, about the sweet spots and the sour ones. They were paying attention, and I knew, or at least I hoped, that they'd pay attention to the 80 acres of stumps too. The machine tells you what you've told it to do. The animal tells you what the ground is telling it to do. My grandfather had said that, and I was betting the farm, or at least a good chunk of my savings, that he was right. I was betting on the quiet authority of 28 animals over the loud certainty of one engine. It was a fool's bet, according to everyone, but I didn't know yet what the horses knew. I only knew they were already at work, and their work was quieter and more important than just pulling. I want to be honest about my reasons. It wasn't just a line from my grandfather that made me spend the money. It was the memory of how he worked, of how he saw the land. He wasn't a sentimental man. He was a practical, hard-working farmer who saw the world in terms of drainage, soil types, and what a piece of ground wanted to be. He'd farmed this same land, walked these same fence lines. He died when I was 20, but he'd left behind more than just the deed to the farm. He left behind a way of looking. I remember standing with him at the edge of that same 80-acre parcel. I must have been 12 or 13. The timber company had just finished logging it off, and it was a wreck of stumps and slash, a torn-up landscape that looked like a battlefield. They took the best and left the rest, it said, not with anger, but with a flat observational tone. Now we've got to clean up the mess. He'd planned to clear it himself, to turn it back into pasture. He talked about how he'd do it with his own team of Belgians, a stone boat, and a lot of patience. He never got the chance. The year after, his heart gave out while mending a fence. The farm passed to my father, who was a different kind of man. My dad believed in the power of the combustion engine. He bought a bigger tractor, a bigger combine. He saw the 80 acres of stumps not as a project, but as a problem too big and too slow to solve. So it sat. For 40 years it sat there, growing up in brush and scrub trees, the stumps slowly rotting, but still holding their ground, a place for deer to bed down and for rabbits to hide. An 80-acre blank spot on the farm's map of productivity. After my own father passed and the farm became my responsibility, I'd looked at that parcel the way he had, a problem. I'd walked it a few times, gotten estimates for bulldozing, for skidders, for stump grinders. The numbers were always too high, the return on investment too far out. So I did what he did. I left it alone. Then, last winter, I was cleaning out the old milk house, a small stone building my grandfather had built that we now use for storage. In a dusty wooden crate full of old veterinary manuals and parts for a cream separator I'd never seen work, I found it. It was a small black-covered ledger, the kind with marbled edges on the paper. The cover was soft with age and stained with something oily that had long since dried. His name was on the inside cover, in his careful, looping script. Thomas Bellwether, 1952. It was his farm journal. For weeks, I'd spend my evenings in the barn, under the light of a single bare bulb, turning the pages. Most of it was what you'd expect, records of breeding dates for the cows, notes on seed varieties, prices for corn and soybeans at the elevator, weather observations written in pencil that had gone faint and brown. First hard frost, October 12th. Rain for 3 days straight, creek out of its banks, May 4th. It was a portrait of a year, of a life, lived in close conversation with the land. It was methodical, unadorned, and beautiful in its precision. I read it cover to cover, feeling like I was getting a second chance to listen to him. Near the back of the book, on a page dated November 1958, after the fall harvest was in and he was planning for the next year, I found a note. It was under a heading that just said, Projects. It listed a few things: new roof on the corn crib, replace the gate on the north pasture. Then the last item on the list, 80 west of the creek. That was the parcel. Underneath it, he'd written a series of short, cryptic lines. Cut over hard, stumps deep. Ground holds water in the low spots. Then the line that made me stop. He'd drawn a rough oblong shape, a sketch of the swale that ran through the middle of the parcel. And inside it, he'd written, check stumps for damp when pulling, never got to it. And then, right at the bottom, with a question mark after it that seemed to hang in the air for 40 years. Water under. I read it a dozen times. Water under. It wasn't a statement. It was a question he'd asked himself, a piece of unfinished business. He'd seen something, or suspected something, about that ground that went deeper than the stumps. He hadn't seen it as just a logging mess. He'd seen a question mark. That's when the idea of the horses began to take root. A skidder wouldn't check the stumps for damp. A skidder operates on the principle of brute force and speed. It would rip and tear, smearing the evidence, compacting the soil with its heavy treads, mixing topsoil with subsoil, until you couldn't read a single sentence the ground was trying to write. The operator, paid by the hour or the acre, would have no reason to stop, to get down off his machine, to examine the roots of a pulled stump. His job was to clear, not to investigate. But horses are different. They work at a walking pace. You're on the ground with them. You handle every chain. You see every stump as it breaks free. You have time to notice. You have time to see if the dirt is darker, if the roots are wetter. You have time to answer a 40-year-old question. The machine was the modern way, the efficient way. It was my father's way. The horses were the old way. They were my grandfather's way. And my grandfather had left me a map, or at least the hint of one. The decision suddenly felt simple. I wasn't being sentimental. I was following a lead. I was picking up a cold case that had been sitting in a dusty crate for 2 generations. The $18,000 for the skidder was the price of erasing the evidence. The cost of the horses, whatever it turned out to be, was the price of a proper investigation. I put the notebook back in the crate, wrapped in an old oilcloth. I knew what I had to do. It still felt like a gamble, but it no longer felt like a folly. It felt like a responsibility. The first few days of the work were a lesson in humility. Harnessing 28 horses, even with the help of my son, who came home from his town job to see the spectacle, was a slow and complicated ballet. These weren't pet ponies. They were 1,400-pound athletes who knew their job better than I did. The harnesses were heavy leather, stiff from disuse, the brass hames cool to the touch in the morning air. The smell of leather and horse sweat filled the barn, a smell that was so old it felt new again. We decided to work them in teams of 4, 2 teams working at a time on opposite ends of the parcel, while the others rested. It took us the better part of the first morning just to get the first team hitched and out to the field. The ground was soft, and the horses sank into their fetlocks as they walked. They were patient, standing quietly while I fumbled with the clevises and chains, my hands clumsy and slow. I'd grown up with tractors, with the immediate roar of a diesel engine. The silence of the horses was unnerving. All I could hear was the wind in the scrub pines, the jingle of the harness chains, and the soft rip of them tearing at a clump of grass. My grandfather's aphorism came back to me. Some work is for tearing down. Some work is for finding out. This, I reminded myself, was the second kind. The first stump was a middling pine about 20 inches across. I dug around it with a spade, clearing the dirt away from the main roots, nicking them with an axe to give them a place to break. Then I wrapped the main chain around the stump, low to the ground, and hooked it to the equalizer bar that spread the load across the 4 horses. I took a deep breath. "All right," I said, my voice feeling small in the open air. I clucked to the team. Nothing happened. They stood there, waiting. I clucked again, a little sharper. The lead horse, a big mare with a broad, intelligent face, turned her head and looked at me. It was not a defiant look. It was a look that said, "Is that really what you want?" I realized my mistake. I hadn't given them a proper command. I was asking, not telling. I took another breath, stood up straight, and said, "Step up, now. Walk on." The words my grandfather would have used. This time, the response was immediate. All 4 horses leaned into their collars as one. The leather creaked. The chains drew tight with a sharp metallic snap. For a moment, nothing moved. It was a perfect, tense stillness. The horses dug in their hooves, their massive shoulder muscles bunching. The stump groaned. Then, with a sound like a giant tearing a cloth, the roots began to give way. One popped, then another. The stump tilted, lifting a ragged halo of black earth with it. The horses took 2 more slow, deliberate steps, and the stump was free, dragged a few feet from its hole before I called, "Whoa!" and they stopped. Instantly. They stood, breathing a little harder, steam puffing from their nostrils in the cool air. I walked over and looked at the stump, at the hole it left behind. It was just a stump. The roots were brown and dry. The dirt that clung to them was the same light, loamy soil that was everywhere else. I felt a small, sharp pang of disappointment. What had I expected? A gush of water? A sign from the heavens? It was just a stump. We did another and another. By the end of the day, we had pulled 12. 12 stumps. A skidder would have done that in less than an hour. We had worked from sunup to sundown, and the 80-acre parcel looked virtually untouched. I was exhausted, my back ached, my hands were raw, and my confidence was beginning to fray at the edges. The neighbor drove by again on his way home, slowing down but not stopping this time. He just gave a little wave, the kind you give someone you feel a bit sorry for. That night, sitting at the kitchen table, my wife looked at my blistered hands. "How many acres did you get done today?" she asked. She is a practical woman, unimpressed by sentiment. She had supported the idea of the horses, but she supported it with the expectation of a result. "We didn't get an acre," I said. "We got 12 stumps." She just nodded, pouring me another cup of coffee. The silence was heavier than the neighbor's polite skepticism. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm. Up before dawn, grain the horses, harness the teams, the long walk out to the work site, the slow, methodical process of stump after stump. Dig, chop, chain, pull. The sounds became familiar, the creak of leather, the jingle of the trace chains, the deep grunt of the horses as they took the strain, the final, satisfying tear of roots letting go of the earth they'd held for 40 years. I learned the language of the team, the subtle shifts in weight, the flick of an ear that told me they were ready. I learned to trust them. If they refused to pull, it wasn't stubbornness, it was because the chain was fouled or their footing was poor. They knew their job. My job was to listen and get out of their way. We cleared the high ground first, the sandy ridge on the eastern edge of the parcel. The stumps came out clean. The pine and oak roots were dry, brittle. The soil was light and fell away easily. It was straightforward work, but I kept thinking about the notebook. Ground holds water in the low spots. As we worked our way down the gentle slope toward the middle of the parcel, I started to notice a change. It was subtle at first. The ground underfoot was a little spongier. The brush grew thicker here. The air felt heavier, more humid. It was the 3rd week of May when we started working in the swale. It wasn't much of a depression, just a long, shallow dip that ran north to south through the heart of the 80 acres, maybe 200 feet wide at its broadest point. You wouldn't notice it from the road, but on foot you could feel it. The ground just seemed to fall away slightly, and the air grew still. The first stump we pulled from the swell was different. It was a big old poplar, and I had to dig deep to get a good hold for the chain. When the team leaned into it, it resisted more than the others had. The horses had to strain, their hooves churning the ground into a dark mud. When it finally came free, it didn't just pop out. It came up with a thick, sucking sound, like a boot being pulled from deep muck. I called a halt and walked over to look. The hole it left wasn't just a cavity of loose dirt. It was dark, wet, and glistening. Water was already beginning to seep into the bottom of it, pooling into a muddy puddle. I looked at the stump itself. The dirt clinging to the roots wasn't the light brown loam of the high ground. It was black, a heavy, greasy, organic black that stuck to my gloves like paint. I knelt down and touched the taproot. It was slick, soaked through. Not just damp from the morning dew, but deeply, fundamentally wet. I broke off a piece of a smaller root. It was pliable, and when I squeezed it, beads of water pushed out and ran down my palm. I stood up and looked around. I looked at the line of stumps we'd already pulled, stretching back up the rise. Then I looked ahead, down the length of the swale, at the hundreds of stumps still waiting. I walked back to the water jug, took out the small field map I'd been making, and with a pencil stub, I made a small X where we'd pulled the wet stump. I circled it. For the rest of that day, we worked exclusively in the swale. Every single stump was the same. They fought harder. They came out with that same sucking sound. And their roots were slick, with that same deep, subterranean wetness. The horses seemed to notice it too. They were more careful with their footing. They'd test the ground before putting their full weight down. And when they pulled, they seemed to lean into the collars with a different kind of effort, a heavy, steady pull suited for mud, not for dry earth. By the end of the day, I had a line of a dozen circled X's on my map, a dotted line following the lowest point of the land. That evening, I didn't go straight into the house. I went back to the milk house, to the wooden crate. I got out my grandfather's ledger. I sat on an overturned bucket, the book open on my knees, the single bulb overhead casting a yellow light on the page. Check stumps for damp when pulling. His 40-year-old handwriting seemed to lift off the page. It wasn't a casual observation. It was an instruction. It was the key to the map he'd never had a chance to draw himself. Water under? The question mark felt enormous now. It wasn't about a little bit of spring runoff. It was about something more. He had suspected a source, a permanent hidden source of water on a piece of ground everyone else had written off as dry, cut-over scrub. The next morning, I was out before 5. I didn't harness the team. I took a soil probe, a long steel rod with an auger at the end, and I walked the line of the swale. I started where we had quit the day before. I pushed the probe into the ground. On the edge of the swale, it went down 2 feet before hitting resistance. I pulled it up. The soil in the auger's threads was moist, but it was still loam. Then I walked 20 paces into the center of the swale to a spot between 2 big stumps. I set the point of the probe and leaned my weight on the handle. This time, it was different. The probe sank. It went down with a smooth hydraulic pressure, almost pulling itself down. I pushed it to its full 4-foot length without hitting anything solid. When I pulled it up, the last 2 feet of the auger were packed not with soil, but with a dense black, peaty muck. It smelled of deep earth and decay and clean water. It was the kind of soil that holds moisture like a sponge, the kind of soil that forms over centuries in a wetland. This wasn't just a low spot. This was something else entirely. For the next month, that became the work. We pulled stumps only within the boundaries of that swale. I didn't care about clearing the whole parcel anymore. I cared about defining the edges of this discovery. Every stump that came out wet, I marked on the map. Every time the horses struggled in the mud, I paid attention. I was no longer just a farmer clearing land. I was a cartographer, mapping a hidden feature of my own farm. The work was slow, muddy, and exhausting. But it wasn't frustrating anymore. It was exciting. Every pulled stump was a new piece of data. Every drop of water squeezed from a root was a confirmation. The line of circled X's on my map grew longer, wider, until it defined a clear, consistent zone about 200 feet wide and running the entire length of the property. My grandfather had seen the question. The horses, in their slow, patient way, were giving me the answer. They never compacted the soil. They never smeared the evidence. They worked with the ground, not against it. And their very difficulty, their struggle in the mud, was the signal I had needed to pay attention. A skidder would have charged through this in 2 days, its operator cursing the soft ground, and all I would have had was a cleared, compacted, muddy mess. I would have never known. By the end of June, we had pulled every stump from the swale. The rest of the 80 acres remained untouched, a fringe of stumps and brush around a wide, clear corridor of black, turned-up earth. The holes left by the stumps had filled with water, creating a series of small, glistening pools that reflected the summer sky. From a distance, it looked like a string of dark jewels laid across the land. I knew I needed someone else to see it, someone who knew more about water than I did. I thought about calling the university extension, but I imagined a young agent with a new degree and a tablet full of data, someone who would talk about perk tests and soil horizons in a way that felt disconnected from the ground beneath his feet. I needed someone who spoke the same language as my grandfather. I called the county Soil and Water Conservation District. I asked for the oldest guy on their roster. His name was George, and he'd been with the district for 40 years. He was 2 years from retirement. When I explained what I was doing over the phone, he was quiet. "You're pulling stumps with horses?" he asked, his voice gravelly. I could hear the skepticism, the same polite disbelief I'd heard from my neighbour, but he agreed to come out. He arrived in a dusty county pickup truck with a dent in the fender and a rack of survey stakes in the back. He was a tall, stooped man in his late 60s, with kind eyes and hands that looked like they'd spent a lifetime working with soil. He didn't say much at first. I just walked him out to the swale. We stood on the edge, looking at the cleared corridor, the dark earth, the pools of water. He took it all in, his gaze moving slowly from one end to the other. "You did all this with draft teams?" he asked. I told him I had. He just shook his head a little, but it wasn't in disbelief this time. It felt more like respect. I showed him my map, the one with the pencil-smudged X's. I showed him a few of the stumps we'd pulled, their roots still dark and heavy. I told him about my grandfather's notebook. He listened to the whole story without interrupting. When I was finished, he just nodded. "Let's take a walk," he said. We walked the length of the swale. He didn't walk on the edges. He walked right down the middle, his boots sinking into the soft ground. Every so often he would stop, crouch down, and pick up a handful of the soil, rolling it between his thumb and forefinger, smelling it. He pointed at the vegetation growing on the uncleared edges. "See that," he said, pointing to a patch of marsh marigolds and rushes. "Those don't grow on dry ground. They're obligate wetland plants. They only grow where their feet are wet most of the year." He was reading the signs I had only just started to learn. When we got to the middle of the parcel, he took a hand auger from his truck, a tool not much different from my own soil probe. He sank it into the ground, turning the handle with a practiced ease. He went down 4 feet, then 6, then 8. He pulled up core samples, laying them out on a small tarp. The top 2 feet were the black, organic muck I had found. Below that was a layer of fine sand, and below that, a layer of dense blue-grey clay. There it is, he said, pointing to the clay layer. That's your confining layer. It's like the bottom of a bowl. He took another sample from the sand layer just above the clay. It was saturated. Water dripped from the end of the auger. He went silent. He just stood there looking at the core sample, then at the wide, wet corridor stretching out before us, then back at the sample. It was a long silence, the kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of calculation and understanding. I waited. I didn't rush him. Finally, he looked at me. He wiped his hands on his trousers. What you have here, he said, his voice quiet and measured, is a spring. Not just one, but a whole artesian system, a perched water table. The water is trapped here by that clay layer, and it's under pressure from the higher ground around it. It's been trying to get out for 1,000 years. He crumbled a piece of the black soil. This isn't just dirt. This is fen peat. It's been forming here since the last glaciers left. This swale has been a wetland, a hidden one, for a very, very long time. He looked back at the horses who were grazing peacefully in their rest pasture. A skidder would have ruined this, he said, almost to himself. The weight would have compacted that peat, squeezed it dry. The tracks would have torn through the confining layer in spots, and your water would have just drained away deep into the subsoil. You would have ended up with a muddy, rutted mess that would have taken a decade to heal, and you would have never, ever known this was here. He looked at me then, and his expression was no longer skeptical. It was something else, a kind of professional awe. What your grandfather suspected and what your horses found, this is substantial. Substantial. It was just one word, but it was the word I had been working all spring to hear. It was validation, delivered not with fanfare, but with the quiet, understated authority of a man who had spent his life reading the ground. He explained that this forgotten spring system was a significant asset. It meant these 20 acres of the swale and the land immediately around it were naturally sub-irrigated. They would stay green all summer, even in a drought. It was perfect for intensive grazing. It was a self-watering pasture. The cost of drilling a well and setting up an irrigation system to do the same thing would be astronomical. The horses hadn't just cleared the land. They had discovered its greatest secret, a secret that made it 10 times more valuable than the stump-ridden ground I had bought. The vindication didn't come with a parade. It came quietly, in the turning of the seasons. After George's visit, I changed my plan. We didn't pull another stump outside the swale. Instead, I hired a man with a small dozer to push the pulled stumps from the wetland corridor into long piles on the dry, high ground, where they could season and be burned the following year. Then I bought seed. Not the standard pasture mix of fescue and orchard grass, but a specialized blend George recommended. One with deep-rooted clovers and bird's foot trefoil, plants that would thrive in the high moisture soil and fix nitrogen, making the ground even richer. We broadcast the seed over the black, turned-up earth in late summer, and the fall rains came right on time. By the first frost, the swale was covered in a faint green haze of new life. The following spring was the real test. While the surrounding pastures were still brown and dormant, the 20-acre strip down the middle of the old stump ground was already a vibrant electric green. The hidden water was working, pushing up the new growth weeks ahead of schedule. By May, the grass was knee-high, a lush, dense carpet of forage. I finally opened the gates and let the 28 Suffolk drafts into the pasture they had cleared. They walked in slowly, their heads up, and then, as if on a signal, they lowered their heads and began to graze. There was a rightness to it, a circle being closed. They were reaping the reward of their own labour, the cost of the horses, the feed, my own sweat equity through that long spring of pulling stumps. It had all seemed like a questionable expense. But now, looking at that strip of prime, self-watering pasture, I did the math a different way. The value of that reliable water source, of that guaranteed green forage in the dry months of July and August, was immense. It changed the carrying capacity of the entire farm. The money I had paid for the horses wasn't an expense. It was the best investment I had ever made. They hadn't cost me money. They had found me a fortune that had been lying dormant under my feet for my whole life. My neighbour drove by one evening in early June. The pasture was at its peak, a river of green flowing through the duller scrub of the uncleared land. He pulled his clean truck over, same spot as always, and rolled down the window. I was leaning on the gate, just watching the horses graze. He looked out at the swale for a long time. He looked at the grass, at the horses, at the pools of water that still glinted at the lowest points. He was a smart man. He understood what he was seeing. He knew what a pasture looked like in a dry June, and this wasn't it. "That's holding green," he said finally. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, offered with a new tone. The bewildered certainty was gone. In its place was a grudging respect. "It's wet ground," I said. "Seems so," he replied. He nodded once, a short, sharp gesture. "You might not have been as wrong as I thought." Then he put the truck in gear and drove on. That was it. That was the concession. There was no big apology, no dramatic admission. There didn't need to be. The land itself was the proof. His brief, understated acknowledgement was more satisfying than any boastful "I told you so" could ever be. It was a conversation between two farmers where the truth is stated plainly, and then you move on. Later that week, I took my grandfather's notebook out to the pasture. I sat on a small rise overlooking the swale. I opened it to the page with the cryptic note: 80 west of the creek, check stumps for damp when pulling. Never got to it. Water under? I took a pencil from my pocket, the lead sharp and dark, not faded like his. Under his 40-year-old question, I wrote a single word. Yes. Then I added, covered it proper. It felt like finishing a sentence he had started a lifetime ago. The work wasn't just about clearing stumps. It was about honouring a question, about having the patience to listen for an answer that the land had been waiting to give. The machine would have given me a clear field. The horses gave me a living pasture. The machine was an answer. The horses were a conversation. A year passed, then another. The cleared swale became the heart of my grazing operation. It was as reliable as a well, a ribbon of green that carried my herd through the driest summers on record. The rest of the 80 acres I left alone. The stumps and the brush provided cover for wildlife, and the contrast between the wild edges and the cultivated centre felt right. It felt balanced. The horses were part of the landscape now. Their coats, the colour of bright chestnut, moved against the deep green of the pasture. They were no longer just a team for pulling stumps. They were part of the farm's living system. Their grazing managed the pasture, and their manure fed the soil that fed the grass that fed them. It was a closed loop of fertility and function, powered by sunlight and water. I often think about the difference between the two ways of working that land. The path I almost took, the one with the diesel skidder, was a path of imposition. It was about forcing my will onto the land, clearing it according to a human timetable and a human-centric idea of efficiency. It measured success in hours and acres and cubic yards of displaced dirt. It was loud, fast, and blind. The path I took, the one with the horses, was a path of inquiry. It was slow, quiet, and attentive. It measured success in observations, in subtle changes in the soil, in the behaviour of the animals. My grandfather's wisdom was not about clinging to the past for its own sake. It was about understanding that some kinds of knowledge can only be acquired at a walking pace. The machine tells you what you told it to do. It is an extension of your own intention. If your intention is simply to remove stumps, that is all it will do. It will not surprise you. It will not tell you a secret. The animal, however, tells you what the ground is telling it to do. It is a translator. Its struggle is information. Its hesitation is a warning. Its preference is a map. It connects you to the land in a way no machine can, because it is itself part of the land. It works from the ground up. This is the lesson I learned from those 28 Suffolk drafts. The difference between a problem and a lesson is often just a matter of whether you were paying attention. Everyone saw 80 acres of stumps as a problem to be solved with brute force. My grandfather saw it as a question to be investigated with patience.
The real value wasn't in the timber that was taken off it, but in the water that was left behind. It was a value that couldn't be seen from the road or calculated on a spreadsheet from the rental yard. It could only be found by hand, by hoof, by listening. We live in a world that is in a hurry, a world that celebrates the machine, the shortcut, the fast answer. We are taught that speed is progress, but there are things you cannot learn in a hurry. There are truths the earth will only reveal to the patient and the quiet. Sometimes the most valuable work is the slowest. Sometimes the most advanced technology is a 1,400-pound animal that knows to step carefully on soft ground. That knowledge is older than any engine, and it will last longer too. The horses are grazing in the swale as I speak. The sun is low, and the green of the pasture is so deep it almost hurts the eyes. The water that feeds it has been there for 10,000 years, waiting.
All it took was the right kind of work to uncover it. It took slowing down enough to read the story the land was writing. It took trusting an old man's forgotten question and the quiet wisdom of an animal. If you have a piece of ground like that, a piece of your own life that everyone has written off as a problem, I'd like to hear about it. Maybe there's a question hidden there too, waiting for someone to have the patience to ask it in the right way. Let me know in the comments below. And if this story meant something to you, subscribe for more. There are a lot of old notebooks out there and a lot of land left to listen to.